let's talk about contenders. So now, what do we talk about being a contender? Well, it's simple. How do you manage your team as a contender? Well, the simple answer here for being a simple question is, well, you just go win the whole damn thing, right? That's what you do. You go out there and win.
Adios.
But, I mean,
that's really simplifying it, I think.
It's easy to say I'm going this year like I'm a contender. How many tweets do we get? How many messages do we get saying, "Hey, I'm a contender. What's your advice?" Well, you can't just say go out there and win. So let's sit here and talk about some advice we can give to contenders, and then we'll flip the script.
What even is a contender? Let's start with that, because I don't even know that people always know whether or not they're actually a contender.
In my opinion, you have to have difference makers at probably 3 positions throughout your lineup, and you have to be a top 2 or 3 player, no doubt. It can't be you're squeezing into the playoffs or you're the bottom part of the playoffs. You really have to be one of these top 3 teams, in my opinion, to be a bona fide contender. And you have to be able to look at yourself and be like, nope, that team's not better than, nope. And you have to be able to say that honestly about 9 times before you're actually a contender.
And not even just that. Sometimes you might be in the top 3, but it's like a real murky top 3 where there's really like 4 or 5 teams there that are about the same. And then there's 1 or 2 that are just absolute studly teams, and your team's not one of them. So you might be 3rd, but there's 2 teams that you have no chance of beating. You're not a contender.
Then you're still not a contender, even if you're 3rd in that, instance.
So I think you have to really look at the entire landscape. Just because your squad is good in a vacuum doesn't mean you're a true contender in your league.
But you're close because you're 3rd. And just like last year, you never know. They could have easily had Christian McCaffrey, Saquon Barkley on the team. That team's unbeatable. By week 3, that team is going to end up with a 3rd overall pick. You know what I mean?
But you don't want to bet that week 1.
No, you don't want to bet it week 1, but you're always contending to win. So the 2 things that both these teams have in common is you still have the same goal. When you play Dynasty Fantasy Football, just like redraft football, we all have one goal, and that is to win a championship. That's a number 1 goal here. Yeah, you're going to be in some leagues where there's teams they seem unbeatable. So how do you get in that level, right? Like any given Sunday, right? Those teams are probably have a first-round bye, so they only have to play 2 games. So you just have to catch that team with 1 good week. So you have to acquire players, like Matt said, difference makers, right? I always believe, I've talked about it for 7 years now, that I think the tight end position's a difference maker position, right? You can get the edge there. Matt mentioned having guys that are difference makers at different positions, like a good solid core, and be able to look at these teams and say you could beat them. I think when you're a contender, it's easy to become complacent, and it's easy to sit on that team and say, I don't have to do anything because this team's so good. But we mentioned before, Saquon, Christian McCaffrey could happen. I think it's important when you're a contender is to figure out how to make small trades and how to acquire guys that aren't necessarily starters, but guys that you could fill in, flex spots, injuries that can get you by, whether it be a backup quarterback, maybe it's an older running back that somebody doesn't want. Maybe it's a PPR running back like Nyheim Hines. That's what I encourage. Spend those draft picks. The least amount of value that 2nd round, 3rd round picks, any of those picks have are when you're a contender. Those are almost meaningless picks. So you want to use those to acquire guys that you hope you never need to start. And so it could be almost of a waste to pick in somebody's eyes, but if they're there when you need them, it's going to be super, super valuable. A guy like a Samaje Perine last year would have helped you win a championship in your championship game last year when he scored 23 points. And maybe at the time you had to give up a 3rd round pick for him.
One of the things that I think can be an easy mistake is I think a lot of times contenders don't always look forward far enough, because a lot of times a lot of the deals aren't made until the trade deadline, which is fine. Sometimes you need to evaluate your team, see where it's at and all that. But that is when you are paying the most expensive cost to get these veteran players. If you know you're a contending team at your team's rookie draft, you already know you're a contender. Try to make some of those moves for the depth pieces, or if you need one more star at running back because you're stacked everywhere else.
That's when you can really cash in on a guy like Chris Carson or something like that, because maybe his value is a little bit depressed just because he's getting a little bit older. Who knows if there's a lot of uncertainty.
Somebody really wants Elijah Moore.
Exactly. And the young hotness is looking really good at that point.
So I think that's one of the biggest mistakes contenders make is they wait too long to think about their trades, and now they're mortgaging their entire future, which sometimes it's worth it to do that, but 4 months earlier, you would have had to pay half of that cost to get the exact same player. So I think you need to think about the life cycle of a dynasty season when you're doing this as well to help maximize your value overall.
Making small moves, it, to me, is very important because everybody in dynasty is always trying to make the big move, but a lot of times it's the small moves that you make that can pay huge dividends down the road when you're trying to make a push.
Yeah, I mean, in years past, there's been guys like Frank Gore and stuff like that, that the aged veteran that just seems to get passed around in dynasty circles, but, you know, obviously he doesn't hold value anymore, so I guess it's not a relevant name, but he was able to win you games late in the season just because he was always there. He was like old reliable, basically. And so you have to find the modern day version of a Frank Gore or one of these type of guys to kind of get you over the hump and just through games sometimes. Just a startable
a guy like Kareem Hunt, who doesn't have a super high ceiling with Nick Chubb there, but you know week in, week out, he's probably going to get you around 10 points. And that could be the difference in when somebody goes down, somebody gets hurt. And I think in the playoffs, that's one thing I want to make sure I have is at least one startable backup at every position, because once you get to the playoffs, if somebody gets hurt, you can't make a trade anymore.
Right, you're done.
And that player's not sitting on the waiver wire. So you just blew your season because you weren't willing to give up your 3rd round pick to get Nyheim Hines to make sure that you had enough startable depth at your running back position.
And Kareem Hunt is a high-end option too, because I mean, if he finds himself into a starting role because of injury to Nick Chubb or anything like that, he can win you games. Like I mean, he's very capable from that, but you're going to pay extra for that as well.
Sure,
you're not going to be getting him for a 3rd round draft pick or a 2nd round draft pick. You're probably going to have to give up a 1st round draft pick to get a guy that's serviceable for the most of the time. Exactly. But, you know, he could win you a championship.
If you're a good team and you do acquire these small pieces and you do draft well and you get some good depth, don't be afraid to, as you get close to the playoffs, to sell off some guys you might not be able to start. Not all of them, but those should be always moves in the back of your mind as well. It's like, okay,
if you've got 4 starting running backs, somebody needs a running back, and you unload a Chris Carson or something
for a 23
like that.
first.
Sure.
Right. Don't be
as long
afraid
as you're
to
confident
there.
that they can't beat you, because the worst would be if you gave them the piece to beat you in the playoffs.
I think that's the biggest worry about some people, like, oh, I can't make them better. I can't give them a player. If you think your team is good enough to win, then that's a risk you should be able to take sometimes, because that's the difference between you doing well long term and then you run the team in the ground. I'm talking about those guys as you get closer, they're fighting to get in.
They're the 7th best team in the league, 8th best team in the league. They're trying to squeak their way into the playoffs.
I made tons of moves with those guys and they missed the playoffs. And more so, their future first. Like, I don't want their 22 first. Like, you go for their 23 first, right? You attack that moment. And maybe you have a guy that's doing pretty well, or you have the guy that popped up that's temporarily good, and you can sell him for like a little draft capital. It's a savvy way to be good for a very, very long time. And that's why we talk about flipping those running backs. Same thing in the offseason. You sell those running backs for future running backs.
And I am all for flipping the running backs at a certain time. But you have to know when to hold and I guess when to fold.
When you're a contender, it's really hard to get good draft picks, right?
It is.
So the more draft capital you have, maybe now you have 112 and you have 1-8. Well, 112 and 1-8 is going to put you in a better position to get 1-3.
I agree with the overall concept of what you're saying. I think it's tougher to execute, though.
And sometimes it's players that turn into like, hey, I have Melvin Gordon, I'm buying Austin Eckler. Sure. Well, now I'm in a really good position where I have both those good players. Because some of those players that you buy,
they'll split off
that are like okay guys could turn out to be really good guys, give you more depth. So the small trades could turn into a big trade. You selling could turn into a big player down the road. There's a lot of ways to do it, because we know when those players are making a push, they get desperate, they'll give up a little bit more. And it's just finding the right value at the right time. That's how you become a very good, well-rounded dynasty manager. Is you're never complacent. As soon as you get complacent, you're getting passed up. Sure. You got to be constantly making moves. And I think a lot of times what people are going to tell you as a contender is buy, 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 buy. But what I'm saying is don't be afraid to sell, is my point.
It's got to be the right situation, but don't be afraid.
But everything's the right. You know what? That's my point. Though. Like, everything's the right situation. Right. It's got to be the right situation to buy. It's got to be the right situation to sell. And it's all in a vacuum, because some leagues are really hard to make trades in, and some are really easy to make trades in. And some have owners that are foolish and they think they can win. And some people are more realistic and they're not gonna buy anything you're selling because they know the position they are in. But it's finding the right owner. It's finding the right player. It's got to be a good fit. But it's your job as a dynasty GM and a dynasty manager to do that. It's why we build the tools that we build to help you navigate those lanes, to find a perfect spot, to give you more information to back up your stance, to let you know where your team really stands. Like it's important. It's important to put in that work. And yes, like redraft, you could luck your way into a championship because you hit on all your draft picks. Sure. You kind of lucked into it. But if you want to, if you put the time in and you dedicate yourself like this, and you're staying at the forefront and making all these moves, odds are you're going to be a true contender and always competing for the ship for many years instead of for that hashtag 2 to 3 year window.